There is a specific kind of exhaustion that only long-haul drivers truly understand. It's not just physical tiredness. It's a deep, bone-aching fatigue that seeps into your mind after staring at the white lines of a highway for 10 hours straight. It was mid-November, and my co-driver Mark and I were hauling a heavy load of commercial supplies down to the south coast. The weather had been miserable since we crossed into Dorset. A relentless, freezing rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the windshield and making the dark roads incredibly treacherous. By the time the clock on the dashboard glowed 2:15 a.m., my eyes were burning. I was hallucinating shadows dancing on the edge of the headlights. I knew if I didn't pull over, I was going to put us in a ditch. Mark was already dead to the world in the sleeper berth behind me, snoring softly over the low hum of the heater. I spotted a small, unlit lay-by surrounded by dense, towering pine trees just off the A35. It was completely empty. I pulled the heavy rig over, killed the engine, and let out a long, shuddering breath. The sudden absence of the engine's roar made the drumming of the rain against the metal roof sound deafening. I locked the doors, pulled my jacket tight around myself, and leaned my head against the cold glass of the driver's side window. I just needed an hour, just 1 hour to close my eyes. I don't know exactly what woke me up. It wasn't a loud noise, it was more of a feeling, a sudden, sharp drop in the temperature inside the cab, as if the heater had been replaced by an open freezer door. I blinked my eyes open. The digital clock read 3:12 a.m. The windows were fogged up from our breath, but the relentless hammering of the rain had completely stopped. In fact, everything had stopped. There was no wind howling through the pines, no distant sound of highway traffic. It was a suffocating, unnatural silence. Then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It was faint, coming from the passenger side door. My heart did a strange flutter in my chest. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town, parked on a pitch-black stretch of road at 3 in the morning. Who the hell would be out here? I leaned over the center console, rubbing the condensation off the passenger window with my sleeve. The sole, flickering amber street lamp at the edge of the lay-by cast a sickly orange glow over the wet asphalt. Standing right outside the door, looking up at the truck, were 2 children. They looked to be about 10 or 11 years old, a boy and a girl. They were dressed strangely, wearing thin, outdated clothing that looked completely inadequate for the freezing November night. No coats, no umbrellas. Yet, despite the torrential rain that had been falling just minutes ago, they didn't look completely soaked. They stood perfectly still, side by side, their heads tilted slightly downward. Tap, tap, tap. The boy raised a pale hand and knocked on the metal of the door again. A wave of intense, irrational panic washed over me. Every primal instinct in my brain suddenly began screaming at me to start the engine and drive away as fast as I could. But my rational mind fought back. They're just kids, I told myself. They must be lost. Maybe their parents' car broke down. I reached over and rolled the passenger window down just a crack, maybe 2 inches. Instantly, the freezing air bit at my face, carrying with it a faint, sickly metallic smell, like old copper. "Hey!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you kids all right? Where are your parents?" The children didn't flinch. They didn't shiver from the cold. The boy slowly tilted his head up towards the gap in the window. His voice, when he spoke, was smooth. Too smooth. It lacked the cadence or emotion of a terrified, lost child. It sounded rehearsed, almost monotonous. "Please, mister, we need help. We are very cold. Please, open the door and let us in." I frowned, feeling a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. "I can't let you in the truck, buddy. It's against company policy. Do you need me to call the police? Or an ambulance?" "We don't need the police," the girl spoke this time, Her voice was identical in tone to the boy's, flat, hollow, and strangely melodic. "We just need to use your phone. We need to call our mother. Please, unlock the door. Let us inside." I looked down at them, and a terrifying sensation began to take hold of me. It felt like my thoughts were wading through thick mud. A heavy, hypnotic pressure pressed against the front of my skull, urging my hand to reach for the unlock button. It would be so easy just to let them in. They just wanted to be warm. They just needed the phone. My fingers actually twitched toward the door handle. "Please," the boy insisted, stepping closer to the truck, stepping fully into the harsh amber light of the street lamp. "We can't come in unless you invite us." As he stepped into the light, he finally looked directly up at me. My breath caught in my throat. My blood ran ice cold. He didn't have normal eyes. Where the white sclera and the colored iris should have been, there was nothing but a solid, terrifying void. Pitch black from corner to corner. They weren't just dark, they looked like twin pools of ink reflecting absolutely no light. They were the eyes of a predator. I looked at the girl. She slowly raised her head, revealing the exact same soulless, pitch-black eyes, staring unblinkingly right into mine. The hypnotic fog in my brain shattered, replaced by an adrenaline rush of pure, unadulterated terror. I scrambled backward, falling back into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grasp the keys. I slammed my hand on the window control, rolling it up tight, and threw myself at the ignition. The diesel engine roared to life with a deafening rumble. In the sleeper berth, Mark shouted, startled awake by the sudden jolt as I slammed the truck into gear. I didn't look back. I stomped on the gas, tearing out of the Layby, the massive tires spinning on the wet asphalt before catching grip. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up and we hit a crowded, brightly lit truck stop 60 miles away. Mark thought I had just had a nightmare, but I know what I saw. I know the feeling of pure, predatory evil that radiated from those small figures in the dark. There are things wandering the desolate roads at night that wear the faces of the innocent. And whatever they are, you must never, ever let them in. There is something inherently wrong about a movie theater after it closes. During the day, it's a place of sensory overload. The smell of hot butter, the blinding neon lights of the arcade, the chaotic chatter of hundreds of people. But at 2:30 in the morning, when the last projector has spun down and the final patron has gone home, the building changes. It becomes a massive, hollow cavern. The silence inside is so heavy it rings in your ears, only occasionally broken by the low, mechanical hum of the central air conditioning, or the sudden, startling pop of the ice machine in the concession stand. I worked the graveyard shift as a maintenance and cleaning supervisor for a massive 16-screen multiplex on the edge of town. It was a Tuesday night in late October. The weather was horrific. A massive storm system had moved in, bringing with it a torrential downpour that hammered against the high glass atrium of the main lobby. The sound of the rain was a constant drumming roar, isolating the building from the rest of the world. My crew had clocked out at 1:30 a.m., leaving me alone to finish the final walkthrough, lock the registers, and arm the security system. I was in the main lobby, pushing a wide dust mop across the patterned carpet, trying to ignore the creeping sense of isolation. The lobby was mostly dark. The only illumination came from the dull yellow emergency lights and the erratic, strobing glow of a racing game left running in the arcade corner. Through the towering floor-to-ceiling glass doors at the front of the building, I could see the sprawling parking lot. It was completely empty, illuminated only by a few flickering sodium vapor streetlights that cast long, wavering reflections across the flooded asphalt. I was just about to put the mop away when I heard it. Thud. Thud. It wasn't a sharp knock. It sounded like the heavy, flat palm of a hand striking the thick, reinforced glass of the main entrance. I froze, the wooden handle of the mop cold in my grip. I looked toward the front doors. Through the rain-streaked glass, silhouetted against the dim orange glow of the parking lot, stood a figure. It was a child. She looked small, maybe 9 or 10 years old, wearing an oversized, faded gray hoodie pulled up over her head. Her hands were tucked into the front pocket, and she was standing perfectly still, facing the locked doors. My first instinct wasn't fear. It was confusion, followed by a sharp pang of concern. We were located in a sprawling commercial district. There were no residential neighborhoods for at least 3 miles. What was a little girl doing out here alone at almost 3 in the morning, in the middle of a torrential downpour? I left the mop leaning against the concession counter and walked slowly toward the entrance. As I got closer, the details became clearer, but they only made the situation more unsettling. Despite the violent storm outside, her gray hoodie didn't look entirely soaked. It clung to her, strangely, stiff and unnatural. Her head was bowed, the hood completely obscuring her face in deep shadow. I stopped about 3 feet away from the glass. The heavy double doors were deadbolted at the bottom and the top. "Hey!" I called out, raising my voice to be heard over the drumming rain on the glass roof. "We're closed!" "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" She didn't react to my voice. She didn't flinch, didn't look around, didn't shiver from the freezing autumn wind. Slowly, she pulled one small, incredibly pale hand from her hoodie pocket and placed it flat against the glass. Then she spoke. I shouldn't have been able to hear her. The glass was thick, designed to muffle the noise of the busy highway nearby. But her voice cut through the barrier and the sound of the storm with terrifying clarity. It sounded as if she were standing right next to me, whispering directly into my ear. "Let me in. I am cold. I want to watch a movie." Her voice was entirely devoid of emotion. It was flat, synthetic, and completely lacking the natural cadence of a child. It sounded like a recording being played back at the wrong speed. A profound, sickening feeling of dread began to pool in my stomach. Every hair on my arm stood on end. My brain was screaming at me that this wasn't a lost little girl. Something was imitating a child, and it was doing a very poor job of it. I can't let you in," I stammered, taking a small half-step backward. "The doors are locked. The alarms are on. I can call the police for you. They can take you home." "Do not call them," she replied instantly, the pitch of her voice not changing a single fraction. "I do not want to go home. I want to come inside. Open the door. It is very easy. Just turn the lock." As she spoke the words, "turn the lock," a wave of immense pressure slammed into the front of my skull. It felt like a physical weight, a dizzying fog that clouded my vision. Suddenly, the idea of unlocking the door didn't seem so bad. It seemed logical. She was just a little girl. She was cold. I had the keys right on my belt. My right hand actually unclipped the heavy ring of keys and began to drift upward toward the deadbolt. I was moving against my own will. I watched my own hand reaching for the metal latch, terrified, trapped inside my own mind. "Just let me in," she whispered, her voice echoing in my head. With a monumental effort, I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek. The sharp burst of pain tasted like copper, but it snapped the hypnotic trance. I violently jerked my hand back, dropping the keys. They hit the linoleum floor with a loud, clattering crash. Startled by the noise, the girl finally tilted her head up. The oversized hood fell back just enough to expose her face to the dim emergency lighting of the lobby. Her skin was the color of old wax, completely bloodless. But it was her eyes that made my heart stop beating. There was no white, no iris, no pupil. They were solid, fathomless pits of absolute blackness. Staring into them felt like staring into an empty abyss, a void that promised nothing but suffering and consumption. They were eyes that had never seen the light of day, belonging to something that was older and darker than the building we stood in. A scream caught in my throat. I stumbled backward, my heel catching on the edge of a carpet mat, and fell hard onto the floor. I didn't care. I scrambled backward like a terrified crab, desperately putting distance between myself and the glass. She didn't try to break the glass. She didn't pound on the door. She just stood there, her pale hand still pressed against the pane, those impossible black eyes locked onto mine. I didn't stop scrambling until I was behind the concession stand. I locked myself in the manager's office, my chest heaving, listening to the rain. I pulled up the exterior security cameras on the monitor. She stood at the doors for another hour, completely motionless in the pouring rain. Then, precisely at 3:33 a.m., she slowly turned and walked away, disappearing into the dark expanse of the parking lot. I quit the next morning. I never worked a night shift again. People tell you to help a child in need, but if you ever see a little girl standing in the rain and your instincts tell you to run, listen to them. Because the things that wander the night know exactly what we are programmed to protect, and they use it against us. There is a term that long-haul truckers throw around in the dimly lit booths of highway diners late at night. We call it highway hypnosis. It happens when you've been driving for too long in the pitch black, the relentless drone of the diesel engine filling your ears, the dashed white lines flashing past your weary eyes until your brain simply checks out. You're awake, your hands are steady on the wheel of a 40-ton machine, but your conscious mind is miles away, drifting in a blank void. I've been driving an 18-wheeler cross-country for 15 years. I thought I had experienced every trick an exhausted mind could play on a person. I was wrong. What happened to me out on Route 50, a desolate stretch of tarmac cutting right through the heart of Nevada, often called the loneliest road in America, permanently changed how I look at the dark shoulders of the highway. It was roughly 2:30 in the morning in late October. It wasn't raining, but a thick, unnatural fog had rolled in off the desert floor, clinging to the asphalt and swirling around my double tires. For hundreds of miles in any direction, there was nothing. No gas stations, no illuminated billboards, no porch lights. The only illumination in the entire world was the twin beams of my headlights cutting weakly into the gray wall of mist ahead. The silence in a place like that is heavy. It's an oppressive, suffocating quiet, as if the desert itself is holding its breath. I was taking a sip of lukewarm black coffee, desperately trying to keep my eyes focused, when a subtle movement caught my attention just ahead, lingering on the right shoulder of the road. Initially, my sleep-deprived brain registered it as a stray coyote or a lost mule deer. Instinctively, I eased my heavy boot off the accelerator. But as the truck closed the distance, the high beam swept across the shoulder and the shapes materialized into something impossible. They were human. I blinked hard, my chest suddenly tightening. Standing completely alone in the freezing, fog-drenched desert wasteland at 2:30 in the morning were two children. A boy and a girl, looking no older than 10 or 11. They were dressed in remarkably thin, faded clothing that offered absolutely zero protection against the biting desert chill. The boy had one arm raised, thumb extended, hitchhiking with a slow, rigid, almost mechanical motion. Normal human empathy screams at you to hit the brakes. Two kids abandoned in the middle of nowhere need help. But every single primal survival instinct buried deep in my DNA instantly flared up, ringing like a deafening alarm bell in my skull. Something was profoundly wrong. There was no broken-down vehicle anywhere in sight, no skid marks, no scattered luggage, just endless miles of barren rock and sagebrush. Instead of pressing the brake pedal An icy wave of pure dread slithered down my spine. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the steering wheel, my foot hovering over the gas. I didn't stop. I blew right past them at 65 miles an hour. As they vanished into the fog behind me, I practically snapped my neck checking the side mirrors. Nothing. The mist swallowed them instantly. I let out a shaky breath, convincing myself it was just a phantom image, conjured by fatigue and too much caffeine. I drove for another 20 miles, my racing heart slowly returning to a normal rhythm. The monotonous thrum of the tires on the pavement began to soothe my frayed nerves. I told myself I was just being paranoid. And then, the darkness ahead parted again. It was them. The exact same boy, the exact same girl, wearing the same faded, inadequate clothes. The boy had his arm raised in that exact same stiff hitchhiking posture. They were standing on the gravel shoulder, looking exactly as they had 20 miles back. My stomach plummeted into an abyss. My brain scrambled to make sense of what I was seeing. It was physically impossible. Not a single vehicle had passed me. There were no shortcuts out here.
They couldn't possibly have outrun an 18-wheeler.
Reality seemed to warp and bend around the edges of my windshield. This time, I didn't have the chance to speed past. When the grill of my truck was less than 50 yards away, the little girl turned her head, locked her gaze onto my headlights, and stepped directly into the middle of my lane. I screamed. I slammed both feet onto the brake pedal with every ounce of strength I had. The massive air brakes locked up. The truck fishtailed, 80,000 pounds of metal screaming in protest as the tires shredded against the asphalt. White smoke plumed into the night air. The rig violently shuddered to a halt, the front bumper stopping mere feet from where the children stood. The diesel engine choked and died. The dashboard lights flickered out. Even the low static of the CB radio vanished. The deafening roar of the screeching tires was instantly replaced by a dead, ringing silence. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, my hands glued to the wheel, hyperventilating. Slowly, deliberately, the two figures walked around the front of the hood and approached my driver's side door. Even though my window was rolled up tight, the temperature inside the cab plummeted instantly. My breath plumed into white clouds in the freezing air. They looked up at me. In the pale, diffused moonlight filtering through the fog, I finally saw their faces clearly. Their skin was the color of old parchment, waxy and bloodless. But it was their eyes that stopped my heart. There were no whites, no irises, just two bottomless, terrifying voids of absolute black. They weren't just dark eyes.
They looked like twin pools of ink that consumed the faint light around them. Staring into them felt like staring into an open grave.
"Open the door," a voice demanded. It didn't come from outside the truck. The voice echoed directly inside my own head. It was a flat, synthesized whisper, devoid of gender or emotion, yet laced with a suffocating, ancient malice. "We need a ride. We are very cold." A heavy, sickening fog rolled into my mind. The sheer terror I felt was suddenly muffled, replaced by a strange, hypnotic compliance. My right hand, completely against my own will, drifted away from the steering wheel and hovered over the metal door latch. I watched my own fingers moving, feeling like a trapped passenger in my own body. "Just unlock it," the voice whispered in my skull. My fingers brushed the cold metal of the lock.
Suddenly, a massive blast of sound shattered the air, the piercing, deafening wail of a freight train's horn from a set of tracks a few miles away. The sharp, violent noise sliced right through the hypnotic haze. I gasped for air, snapping out of the trance. Panic flooded my veins like liquid fire. I grabbed the ignition key and twisted it violently. By some absolute miracle, the heavy engine roared back to life. I threw the transmission into gear, cranked the wheel hard to the left to swerve around them, and stood on the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, tearing away into the fog. I drove like a madman until the sun finally breached the horizon, burning away the mist and the shadows. I still drive, but I never take Route 50 at night anymore, because I know now that the empty stretches of the world aren't entirely empty.
There are things out there, wearing the skins of children, waiting in the dark for you to stop. There is a profound, almost primal sense of security that comes with being inside your own home during a violent storm. When you lock the deadbolt and draw the curtains, you create a physical barrier between yourself and the chaotic, untamed world outside. You feel untouchable. But I learned the hard way that a wooden door and a metal lock are only effective against things that abide by the rules of our reality. About 3 years ago, I rented a small, isolated A-frame cabin nestled deep in the evergreen forests of the Pacific Northwest. I had moved there seeking solitude, a quiet place to disconnect and write. The nearest neighbor was a mile down a winding dirt road, and the town itself was a 40-minute drive away. It was late November, the season when the rain in that part of the country stops being a weather event and becomes a permanent state of existence. On this particular night, a massive storm system was battering the coastline. The wind was howling through the towering pines, making the ancient timber of the cabin groan and creak. The rain was lashing against the roof in relentless, deafening waves. I was sitting in an armchair by the fireplace, wrapped in a thick blanket, nursing a mug of tea. The clock on the mantel ticked past 1:15 a.m. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the living room walls. I was just about to turn off the reading lamp and head up to the loft to sleep. Then I heard it. It was faint at first, easily masked by the roar of the wind, but it possessed a pitch that cut straight through the low frequencies of the storm. I froze, my hand hovering over the lamp switch, straining my ears. It came again. A high-pitched, shuddering wail. It was the distinct, undeniable sound of a young child crying. My heart did a painful stutter in my chest. I set my mug down on the coffee table, the ceramic clinking loudly in the quiet room. I walked over to the front window, pressing my face against the cold glass, trying to peer out into the darkness. The porch light was off, and the night was an impenetrable wall of black and driving rain. The crying grew louder. It wasn't the annoyed whine of a toddler throwing a tantrum. It was the raw, breathless sobbing of a child in absolute, terrifying distress. It sounded like it was coming from right outside my front door. Confusion wrestled with a sudden, overwhelming spike of adrenaline. We were miles from anywhere. Who could possibly be out in these woods in the middle of a torrential downpour? A horrific scenario flashed through my mind. A car crash on the muddy logging road nearby, parents incapacitated, a terrified toddler wandering into the dark toward the only light they could see. I didn't think about my own safety. The parental protective instinct hardwired into every human being simply took over. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the entryway table and hurried to the front door. "Hold on!" I shouted through the thick oak door, hoping my voice could carry over the storm. "I'm coming! You're okay!" I threw the deadbolt. The heavy metallic clack echoed in the small entryway. I grabbed the brass handle, pulled the door inward, and stepped out onto the sheltered overhang of the porch, clicking the heavy flashlight on. The beam of light sliced through the rain, illuminating the wooden planks of the deck. Sitting huddled in the corner, pressing its knees to its chest, was a small figure. It was a little boy. He looked to be about 6 or 7 years old. He was wearing a faded yellow raincoat, but his head was bare, his dark hair plastered to his forehead by the freezing water. His face was buried in his arms, his small shoulders heaving with violent, agonizing sobs. Hey, it's all right," I said,
my voice softening as I took a cautious step forward. The wind whipped freezing rain onto my face, but I barely registered the cold. "Are you hurt? Where is your mom and dad?" I reached out, intending to gently touch his shoulder, to guide him inside where it was warm. But the moment my foot creaked on the floorboard directly in front of him, the crying stopped. It didn't taper off. There were no lingering sniffles, no catching of breath, no ragged exhales. It just ceased, instantly and completely, as if someone had abruptly pulled the plug on a stereo speaker. The sudden, unnatural silence from the boy sent a jolt of ice water through my veins. My hand hovered in the air, mere inches from his shoulder. Slowly, deliberately, the boy lowered his arms. He lifted his head to look up at me. The beam of my flashlight hit his face, and every ounce of warmth drained from my body, replaced by a suffocating, paralyzing terror. His skin was impossibly pale, possessing a sickening, translucent quality that looked like wet marble. But his eyes, God, his eyes. There were no irises. There were no whites. They were completely, entirely black. They were not eyes. They were twin voids, absorbing the beam of my flashlight without reflecting a single speck of light back. They were pools of endless, ancient darkness that belonged to a predator, not a child. I was completely paralyzed. My lungs forgot how to draw breath. The thing, wearing the shape of a little boy, didn't blink. The corners of its mouth twitched upward into a faint, rigid smile that didn't reach those terrifying eyes. When it spoke, the voice did not match the small frame. It was a dual resonance, a child's pitch layered over something deep, metallic, and buzzing, like a swarm of hornets trapped in a tin can. "I am so very cold," it said, taking a small, slow step toward my open door. "Invite me inside to warm up." The command carried a physical weight. A wave of dizziness washed over me, a dark fog creeping into the edges of my vision, urging my mind to step aside and just let the poor freezing boy into the house. It was a hypnotic, suffocating pull. But the sheer, unadulterated evil radiating from it triggered my fight-or-flight response. Adrenaline violently kicked my system back online. I gasped for air, stumbling backward into the house. I slammed the heavy oak doors shut with enough force to rattle the picture frames on the wall. I threw my weight against it, frantically twisting the deadbolt, sliding the chain lock into place, and locking the doorknob. I backed away from the door, my chest heaving, the flashlight trembling violently in my hand. I stood in the hallway, listening. Outside, there was no sound of footsteps retreating down the porch steps. There was no more crying. There was only the howling of the wind and the relentless drumming of the rain. I sat awake in the corner of my living room until the sun finally rose, clutching a fire poker, jumping at every creak of the timber. I moved out of that cabin 3 days later. To this day, whenever I hear a child cry in public, my stomach ties itself into knots. I know now that some predators in the dark don't hunt us with fangs or claws. They hunt us with our own humanity. And if you ever hear a weeping child outside your door in the dead of night, whatever you do not open it. There is a very specific, visceral unease attached to brightly lit gas stations in the dead of night. They exist as these isolated, humming islands of harsh fluorescent light surrounded by an ocean of absolute darkness. When you stand beneath that glowing canopy at 3 in the morning, the silence of the sleeping world around you feels less peaceful and more like a trap. You are exposed. You are bathed in a spotlight for anything lurking in the shadows to see. It was a Tuesday in early spring.
I had been working a grueling late shift at a warehouse 2 towns over and was driving home via the winding 2-lane backroads to avoid the interstate construction. My fuel gauge was hovering dangerously below the red line, so I pulled into a dilapidated 24-hour service station, sitting alone at a forgotten rural intersection.
The station was completely deserted. The attendance booth was locked behind thick, bulletproof glass, the cashier fast asleep in a chair with a baseball cap pulled over his eyes. I parked my old sedan at pump number 4, the one furthest from the building and closest to the dark perimeter of the surrounding woods. I swiped my card, selected the fuel grade, and stood by the rear quarter panel, listening to the rhythmic metallic clunking of the pump. The night air was unseasonably cold, carrying the sharp metallic scent of ozone and impending rain. The canopy lights above me flickered erratically, emitting a low, angry electrical buzz. I was staring blankly at the numbers ticking up on the digital display when the hairs on the back of my neck suddenly stood on end. It was an intense physical sensation. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of being watched. It wasn't a casual glance. It was a targeted, predatory focus boring directly into the side of my head. Human instinct is a dangerous thing. Every fiber of my being told me to keep my eyes on the pump, to finish getting gas, and to leave without looking around. But the primal urge to identify the threat won out. I slowly turned my head toward the darkness beyond the edge of the concrete lot. Standing by the rusted air compressor, just at the boundary where the harsh white light met the pitch-black shadows of the trees, was a figure. It was a child, a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old. He was wearing a dark, oversized hooded sweatshirt that hung loosely down to his knees. His hands were shoved deep into the front pockets. He wasn't moving. He wasn't shivering in the biting wind. He was standing perfectly rigid, facing my car. And then, I made the most catastrophic mistake you can make when dealing with things that belong in the dark. I locked eyes with him. The moment our gazes met, a wave of profound, sickening cold washed over my entire body. My stomach dropped as if I had just stepped off a ledge. Even from 30 feet away, under the flickering, sickly glow of the canopy, I could see his eyes. They were wrong. They were utterly, terrifyingly wrong. There was no white sclera, no colored iris reflecting the overhead lights. They were solid, fathomless pits of glossy black. They looked like 2 drops of spilled ink on a canvas of pale, waxy skin. He didn't blink. He didn't look away. Instead, a slow, unnatural smile began to stretch across his face, a rigid, too wide grimace that exposed a row of small, perfectly uniform teeth. Slowly, he pulled one hand from his oversized pocket and pointed a single bone-white finger directly at my chest. Panic, pure and unadulterated, exploded in my chest. I didn't wait for the tank to fill. I violently yanked the nozzle out, splashing gasoline down the side of my car, and slammed it back into the holder. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and slammed my hand down on the ignition. The tires shrieked against the concrete as I tore out of the station, leaving the slow burn of the fluorescent lights far behind. I hit the dark, winding country road going 80 miles an hour, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I kept my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, terrified of what I might see. For the first 5 miles, there was nothing. Just the empty, twisting ribbon of asphalt illuminated by my red taillights. I started to convince myself I had escaped. But as I took a sharp bend, a pair of headlights suddenly appeared in my rearview mirror. They were dim, uneven, and positioned too high off the ground for a standard car. At first, they were far back, but within seconds they closed the gap with impossible speed, tailgating me so closely that the cab of my car was flooded with blinding, yellowish light. I pressed the accelerator to the floor. The engine roared, the speedometer needle climbing to 90, then 95. but the headlights stayed perfectly glued to my bumper. They mirrored every swerve, every erratic turn I took through the labyrinth of back roads. The psychological torture was unbearable. The silence in my car was deafening, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the terrifying realization that I was being herded, hunted. I took a desperate, tires-squealing turn into my sprawling suburban neighborhood, praying the sudden change in environment would lose them. I navigated the maze of familiar streets, blowing past stop signs until I finally turned onto my cul-de-sac. I checked the mirror. The headlights were gone. The road behind me was empty. A massive, shuddering sigh of relief escaped my lips. I had lost them. I pulled into my driveway, the motion sensor security floodlight attached to the garage instantly clicking on, bathing the front lawn in brilliant white light. I threw the car into park and let my head fall against the steering wheel, trying to calm my racing heart. I took a deep breath and looked up through the windshield. My blood froze solid in my veins. Standing at the very end of my driveway, just millimeters beyond the reach of the security light, was the boy in the oversized hoodie. He hadn't followed me in a car. He had simply beaten me here. He stood there in the darkness, his pale face illuminated just enough by the scattered light to reveal that impossible, rigid smile. His solid black eyes were locked onto mine through the glass, and slowly, agonizingly slowly, he raised his pale hand and pointed that single, bone-white finger directly at my front door. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor of my hallway with a heavy iron fire poker, listening to the silence of the house, waiting for a knock that never came. They say these entities need permission to cross a threshold, but what haunts me most, what keeps me awake every single night, is the terrifying knowledge that they don't need permission to wait in the dark outside your window. There is an unspoken hierarchy of safety when it comes to the layout of a house. The ground floor is vulnerable. It is where you double-check the deadbolts, where you pull the heavy curtains closed as soon as the sun goes down, and where you install motion sensor lights. But the second floor? The second floor is a sanctuary. When you walk up those stairs and retreat to your bedroom, you leave the threats of the ground level behind. You don't worry about someone looking through your window when that window is 22 feet suspended in the air. I lived in a tall, narrow, colonial-style house in a quiet, densely wooded suburb. My bedroom was at the very back of the house on the second floor, overlooking a steeply sloping backyard. Because of the sharp drop-off of the hill, my window was actually much higher than a standard second-story room. From my vantage point, looking out felt like being in a watchtower. There were no balconies beneath me, no roof overhangs, and no tree branches close enough to touch the siding of the house. It was mid-October, and a bitter, freezing rain had been falling steadily for 3 days straight. The kind of relentless, driving rain that turns the world outside into a blurred, gray canvas and makes the inside of your bedroom feel like a warm, insulated cocoon. It was approaching 2 a.m. I was lying in bed with just a small bedside lamp illuminating the room, listening to an audiobook, fighting the heavy pull of sleep. The rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass was a hypnotic, soothing lullaby. Then, a new sound cut through the white noise. Scratch. Scratch. Tap. It was faint, muffled by the double-paned glass and the howling wind, but it was distinct. It sounded like fingernails dragging lightly down the wet glass, followed by a single, deliberate knock. I paused my audiobook. The sudden silence in my headphones made my heartbeat feel incredibly loud. I stared across the dark room at the window. The heavy, dark blue blackout curtains were pulled tightly shut. Scratch. Tap. My logical brain immediately scrambled for a rational explanation. A bird blown off course by the storm? A loose piece of siding flapping in the wind? But the rhythm was too deliberate. It possessed a cadence that felt undeniably intentional. I threw off my heavy quilt. The hardwood floor was freezing against my bare feet as I slowly walked across the room. As I got closer to the window, the temperature seemed to plummet. A bitter draft was radiating through the glass, carrying a faint, bizarre scent that seeped through the window frame. Something that smelled like stagnant water and ancient turned earth. I stood inches from the thick curtains, my hand trembling slightly as I reached out and grasped the fabric. I held my breath, expecting to pull it back and see nothing but the reflection of my own terrified face in the dark glass. I pulled the curtain aside just an inch. My heart completely stopped. All the air was violently sucked out of my lungs. Pressed flat against the outside of the glass, staring directly in at me, was a face. It belonged to a teenager, perhaps 16 or 17 years old. His skin was a ghastly, translucent white, devoid of any warmth or blood, glowing faintly in the dim ambient light spilling from my lamp. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead by the freezing rain, water cascading down his cheeks in relentless streams. But none of that was what paralyzed me. It was his eyes. They were massive, taking up too much space on his pale face, and they were entirely, impossibly black. No whites, no irises, just absolute, fathomless voids that seemed to swallow the dim light from my bedroom. They were the eyes of a deep-sea predator, completely dead, yet burningly aware. My mind violently rejected the image. The rational part of my brain was screaming that this was impossible. My bedroom was 22 feet off the ground. The wall outside was sheer, smooth vinyl siding. There was absolutely nothing out there for a person to stand on. No ladder could be placed on the steep, muddy hill below without instantly sliding out. Yet there he was, not clinging to the sill, not struggling to hold on. He was perfectly steady, as if he were simply standing on solid ground that happened to exist 2 stories in the air. He didn't blink. He didn't break eye contact. He raised one pale, slender hand and pressed his palm flat against the wet glass. Tap, tap. He knocked with his knuckles. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. Then his pale lips parted. I couldn't hear his voice over the storm, but the thick glass didn't matter. The words formed directly inside my mind, a cold, echoing whisper that made my teeth ache. "Let me in. It's a long way down. I want to come inside." The hypnotic pull was instantaneous and terrifying. A heavy lethargy washed over my limbs. My hand, still clutching the curtain, began to drift toward the metal latch of the window lock. My brain felt as though it had been wrapped in thick wool. The terrifying face suddenly looked pitiful. "He's just a boy," a treacherous thought whispered in my mind. "He's freezing." My fingers grazed the cold metal of the lock. The physical shock of the freezing metal jolted me awake. I violently yanked my hand back as if I had touched a hot stove. The spell shattered, replaced by a surge of pure, primal adrenaline. I let go of the curtain, letting it fall shut, completely blocking the glass. I stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of my rug, and fell hard onto my back. I scrambled into the furthest corner of my room, pulling my knees to my chest, unable to tear my eyes away from the blue fabric of the curtains. Tap, tap, tap. He knocked again, more insistent this time. I sat in that corner for 5 agonizing hours. I didn't move. I didn't reach for my phone. I just listened to the rain, waiting for the sound of shattering glass. It never came. When the gray light of dawn finally seeped through the edges of the curtains, the tapping had long since stopped. I eventually found the courage to look out. The window was empty, but clearly visible on the outside of the glass, 22 feet in the air, was the greasy, smeared handprint of a child. I permanently screwed that window shut the next day. I learned a terrifying truth that night. Height offers no protection from things that don't obey the laws of our reality. They are always out there, waiting in the dark, and they only need you to open the door or the window.
There is a unique kind of vulnerability that comes with being left in charge of an old house during a severe summer storm. The kind of storm that doesn't just pass over, but seems to anchor itself right above your roof, unleashing a biblical fury of wind and water. I was 19 at the time, and my younger brother Leo was 14. Our parents had driven a few towns over for an anniversary weekend, leaving us alone in our family's sprawling, century-old farmhouse. The house sat at the end of a long dirt driveway, surrounded by miles of dense cornfields that rustled like dry bones in the wind. It was a sweltering Saturday in late July when the supercell hit. The sky turned a bruised, sickly shade of purple and green just before sunset. By 10 p.m., the power lines had snapped. We were plunged into absolute darkness, relying on a few scattered hurricane lanterns. The heat inside the house was stifling, so Leo and I had dragged our mattresses down to the main living room, right next to the heavy oak front door, hoping to catch a cross breeze from the cracked windows. The storm was deafening. The rain didn't just fall, it was driven horizontally by gale-force winds, violently lashing against the siding. The thunder wasn't a distant rumble, it was a physical force, a concussive boom that rattled the window panes in their frames and vibrated deep within our chests. We had finally managed to fall into a restless sleep around 1 a.m. Then, something cut through the cacophony of the storm. Bang, 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 bang! It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a stray tree branch. It was a frantic, violent pounding on our heavy oak front door. The force of it was so intense that I could actually see the thick wood shuddering in the dim, ambient light of the storm. Leo shot up from his mattress, gasping, his eyes wide with sleep-drugged panic. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Bang, bang, bang! "Stay here," I ordered, throwing off my blanket. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I grabbed the heavy cast-iron flashlight from the coffee table. Human nature dictates that if someone is pounding on your door in the middle of a catastrophic storm, they are in desperate need of shelter. But as I crept toward the entryway, a sickening feeling of pure dread began to coil in my stomach. We were 3 miles from the main highway. The dirt road leading to our house would be a river of thick mud by now. Nobody could have driven up here. "Open the door!" a voice screamed from the other side. It was a child's voice, a little boy. But the volume and the raw, unhinged desperation in it made the hairs on my arm stand up. "Let us in, please! We're cold! We need to come inside right now!" Leo was suddenly right behind me. "It's just kids," he said, his voice laced with instant sympathy. "They must be freezing. We have to let them in." He reached past me, his hand extending toward the heavy brass deadbolt. "Wait!" I hissed, grabbing his wrist. "Something isn't right." Bang, bang, bang! The door rattled violently on its hinges. The sheer physical force being applied to the thick oak was impossible. It sounded like a grown man swinging a sledgehammer, yet the voice crying out was undeniably that of a prepubescent boy. "Let me go!" "They're going to drown out there," Leo argued, struggling against my grip. His eyes looked strangely glazed over, his focus entirely consumed by the door. The hypnotic pull of the entities was already working on him, weaponizing his natural empathy. "Just let me look first," I said, shoving him slightly behind me. Flanking our front door were two narrow panels of frosted decorative glass. If you pressed your face right up against the pane, you could barely make out distorted shapes on the porch. I leaned in, my breath fogging the cold glass, and peered out. Through the distortion and the sheets of rain, I could see two figures standing on the welcome mat. They were small, children, but they weren't huddled together for warmth. They were standing perfectly straight, completely rigid, unfazed by the howling wind tearing through the porch. "Please!" The boy's voice came again, but this time he wasn't screaming. He was speaking in a normal, conversational volume, yet the words pierced through the roaring storm with terrifying clarity. It sounded as though he were standing right beside me in the hallway. "Your brother wants to help us. Just turn the lock." Leo lunged forward, his hand fully gripping the deadbolt. "I have to let them in," he muttered, in a monotone, breathless voice. "They're just kids. They're just kids." "Leo, stop!" I yelled, tackling him away from the door. We crashed onto the hardwood floor. He fought me with a sudden, unnatural strength, his eyes wide and unblinking, entirely fixated on the brass lock. At that exact moment, a massive fork of lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the world outside in a blinding, strobing flash of white light. For a fraction of a second, the frosted glass became perfectly transparent. I saw them clearly. A boy and a girl, maybe 10 years old. Their skin was a sickening, bloodless gray, and as the lightning flashed, they both tilted their heads and looked directly at me through the glass. There was no white in their eyes, no color, just absolute pitch-black voids that swallowed the lightning's glare. They were masks of innocent flesh stretched over something ancient and predatory. "Leo, look!" I screamed, pinning him down and pointing at the window. Another flash of lightning. Leo saw the faces pressed against the glass. The hypnotic trance shattered instantly. His unnatural strength vanished, replaced by a terrified, guttural sob. We scrambled backward on our hands and knees, scrambling away from the door until our backs hit the living room wall. The pounding abruptly stopped. The frantic cries ceased. For the rest of the night, there was nothing but the sound of the rain. We sat huddled in the corner, gripping that cast-iron flashlight like a weapon, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, waiting for the glass to shatter. When morning finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a gray, washed-out sky. We cautiously opened the front door. The porch was empty, but when I looked at the heavy oak door, my stomach churned. There, stamped into the thick wood at the height of a child's chest, were deep, splintered indentations. No child's fist could have made them. Whatever was wearing those human faces outside our door that night hadn't been knocking. It had been trying to bash its way in. And if my brother had turned that lock, I know for a fact we wouldn't be here to tell the story. There is a romanticized idea of camping that we all buy into. We pack up our cars, leave the safety of our fortified suburban homes, and drive out into the wilderness to reconnect with nature. But we often forget that when you pitch a tent in the deep woods, you are willingly surrendering all your defenses. You are trading deadbolts and alarm systems for a thin layer of nylon and a zipper. You are placing yourself on the menu of an ecosystem that is ancient, indifferent, and incredibly dark. It was late August, the dying days of summer, and my wife, Sarah, and I decided to take our two young kids, 7-year-old Ethan and 5-year-old Lily, on a weekend camping trip to the Black Forest region of Pennsylvania. We booked a remote, primitive campsite at the very end of a gravel service road. There were no RV hookups, no shower blocks, and our nearest neighbor was easily a mile away through dense, impenetrable pine trees. The first day was perfect. We hiked, roasted hot dogs over an open fire, and told silly ghost stories.
By 9:30 p.m., the kids were exhausted. We tucked them into their sleeping bags inside our large family tent, zipped the mesh doors shut, and Sarah and I retreated to our canvas folding chairs by the fire ring. It was a beautiful, clear night. The fire popped and hissed, sending bright orange sparks floating up toward a canopy of brilliant stars. The forest around us was alive with the comforting, rhythmic symphony of late summer. The chirp of thousands of crickets, the low croak of bullfrogs from a nearby creek, and the gentle rustle of the wind through the high branches. I was pouring us 2 mugs of hot cocoa from a thermos when the change happened. It wasn't gradual. It was an instantaneous, unnatural cessation of sound. 1 second, the forest was deafeningly loud with the noise of insects and frogs. The next second, it was as if a heavy, invisible blanket had been dropped over the entire mountain. The crickets went completely dead. The frogs fell silent. Even the wind seemed to stop dead in its tracks. The only sound left in the world was the crackle of our dying campfire. Sarah noticed it too. She lowered her mug, her brow furrowing in the flickering firelight. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, instinctively lowering her voice, as if afraid of waking whatever had caused the silence. "The bugs stopped," I replied quietly, a strange, cold knot forming in the pit of my stomach. "Maybe a predator is nearby, a coyote or a bear." I stood up, grabbing the heavy, high-lumen mag light resting on the picnic table. I didn't turn it on yet, not wanting to blind us and ruin our night vision. I just stood by the fire, scanning the perimeter of our campsite, peering into the pitch-black wall of trees that surrounded our small circle of light. That was when I felt it. A heavy, suffocating pressure pressing against the back of my neck. The undeniable, primal sensation of being watched. I slowly turned my head toward the dense thicket of pines just behind our tent. The firelight only reached about 15 feet into the woods before the shadows became absolute. But standing right there, perfectly still, on the very edge of the darkness, was a figure. My breath caught in my throat. I squeezed the heavy metal handle of the flashlight. It was a little girl. She looked to be about 8 or 9 years old. She was wearing a pristine, stark white nightgown that fell past her knees, a garment that looked decades out of place and completely absurd for a deep woods camping trip. Her dark hair hung in lank, damp strings around her pale face, despite the fact that it hadn't rained in days. "Hey!" I called out, my voice sounding incredibly loud and harsh in the dead silence. "Are you okay? Where are your parents? Are you lost?" Sarah gasped, jumping up from her chair and following my gaze. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Is that a little girl? Out here?" The child didn't respond to my questions. She didn't shiver in the cool night air. She just stood there, her head tilted slightly downward. Then, very slowly, she raised her head and took a single, deliberate step forward, crossing the threshold from the shadows into the faint, flickering amber glow of our campfire. The moment the light hit her face, a wave of profound, sickening terror washed over me. It was a physical blow that buckled my knees. Her skin wasn't just pale. It was the color of old chalk, devoid of any vascular warmth. But it was her eyes that made my blood run cold. They were massive, completely filling the sockets. There was no white, no iris, just solid, glossy, pitch-black voids. The firelight dancing in front of us should have reflected in her eyes, but it didn't. Those black pits simply absorbed the light, offering nothing but an endless, horrifying emptiness. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice trembling violently. "Get behind me. Do not look at her." But it was too late. The girl parted her pale, bloodless lips. When she spoke, she didn't raise her voice, yet the sound carried over the crackling fire with an impossible, echoing clarity. It didn't sound like a child. It was a flat, synthesized drone, layered with a buzzing frequency that vibrated in my teeth. "I heard your children," the entity said, its black eyes locking onto mine, though its body remained perfectly rigid. "They sound very happy. I am so lonely. Unzip the tent. I want to go inside and play with them." The terror that ripped through me wasn't just fear. It was an explosive, violent surge of parental instinct. The thought of this demonic, soulless thing wanting access to my sleeping children shattered the paralyzing shock. "Get in the car!" I roared at Sarah. "Get in the car now!" I didn't care about our gear. I didn't care about the $500 tent, the coolers, or the expensive sleeping bags. I spun around, grabbed the zipper of the tent, and violently yanked it open. I dove inside, grabbed Ethan under one arm and Lily under the other, yanking them right out of their sleeping bags. They woke up instantly, screaming in confusion and terror. I practically threw them into the back seat of our SUV. Sarah was already in the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life, the headlights tearing through the darkness. I slammed the back doors shut, jumped into the passenger seat, and yelled, "Go, go, go!" Sarah slammed on the gas. The heavy tires spun in the dirt before catching grip, launching us down the pitch-black gravel road. As we tore out of the campsite, I looked in the side mirror. Illuminated by the red glow of our taillights, the little girl in the white nightgown was standing directly in the center of our abandoned campsite, right next to the open door of our tent. She wasn't chasing us, she was just watching us leave, a rigid, unnatural smile stretching across her pale face. We didn't stop driving until we hit a brightly lit gas station 2 hours away. We left hundreds of dollars worth of camping gear in those woods and never went back to claim it. Whenever people talk about how peaceful and serene the deep forest is at night, I just nod and stay quiet. Because I know that if you go far enough into the dark, you will eventually find things that are incredibly old, incredibly evil, and deeply envious of the warmth inside your tent. If you have never spent a late summer night in the deep American South, you might not understand just how incredibly loud the darkness can be. The nights down here are not quiet. They are a deafening, chaotic symphony of life. Millions of cicadas screaming in the high branches, the guttural, rhythmic croaking of bullfrogs from the muddy banks of the bayou, and the constant, high-pitched whine of mosquitoes. It is a wall of sound, so dense and continuous that your brain eventually filters it out into a dull, vibrating background hum. I live in a raised Acadian-style house at the end of a 2-mile gravel driveway in rural Louisiana. My property borders hundreds of acres of protected, untamed swampland. It's isolated, humid, and normally very peaceful. It was mid-August, right in the middle of a brutal heat wave. Even at midnight, the temperature was hovering around 85 degrees, and the air was so thick with humidity you felt like you had to chew it before you could breathe. I was sitting in a rocking chair on my wraparound porch, a glass of iced tea sweating in my hand, just trying to catch a stray breeze off the water. The porch light was off to avoid attracting the massive swarms of moths. The only illumination came from a pale, hazy half-moon hanging low in the sky. The cicadas were at their peak, a vibrating roar that echoed through the Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks. And then, it happened. It didn't fade, it didn't taper off. It was a violent, instantaneous cessation of all sound. 1 second the swamp was roaring. The next second, it was as if someone had flipped a master switch on the entire ecosystem. The cicadas simply stopped. The frogs fell dead silent. Even the rustling of the dry leaves in the trees ceased. The sudden silence was so absolute, so heavy, that it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. My ears actually popped, as if there had been a sudden, massive drop in barometric pressure. The air grew stagnant and icy cold, cutting through the suffocating summer heat like a razor blade. I stopped rocking. My hand gripped the armrest of the chair so tightly my knuckles ached.
Animals don't just stop making noise for no reason. In the wild, complete silence means only one thing: an apex predator has entered the hunting ground. I strained my eyes, peering into the gloom at the end of my long gravel driveway. Crunch, crunch. Footsteps. Slow, methodical, and perfectly synchronized. A wave of irrational panic washed over me.
Nobody walks down a 2-mile dirt road in the middle of the bayou at midnight. There was no sound of a car engine shutting off, no headlights sweeping through the trees. Just the sound of shoes on gravel, steadily approaching my house. 2 figures emerged from the dense shadows of the tree line, stepping onto the manicured grass of my front lawn. They were children. A boy and a girl, neither looking older than 12. As they walked toward the porch, my mind screamed at the wrongness of the scene. They were wearing heavy, dark, winter-style clothing, long sleeves, thick trousers, and coats. In 85-degree heat with 90% humidity, they should have been drenched in sweat, gasping for air. But they weren't. They moved with a stiff, effortless glide. And they weren't swatting at the thick clouds of mosquitoes that normally swarm anything with a pulse. They stopped at the bottom of the wooden porch steps, about 10 feet away from me. "Evening," I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the unnatural vacuum of the night. "You kids lost? Your folks' car break down on the main road?" They didn't look at each other. They didn't exhibit any of the natural fear or relief a lost child would show upon finding an adult. The boy slowly tilted his head up. "We are lost. We need to use your telephone," he said. The voice sent a jolt of pure ice down my spine. It lacked any inflection, any emotion. It was a flat, monotonous drone, yet it carried an underlying, buzzing frequency that made the fillings in my teeth ache. It sounded like an imitation of human speech, synthesized by something that didn't have vocal cords. "I can call the sheriff's deputy for you," I replied, my instincts screaming at me to stand up and retreat into the house. "He can come pick you up. I'll bring the cordless phone out here." "No," the girl spoke this time. Her voice was identical to the boy's, the exact same pitch, the exact same soulless cadence. "We must come inside. Our mother is waiting for our call. We cannot stay out here. Let us in." "I'm not letting strangers into my house in the middle of the night," I said firmly, finally pushing myself up from the rocking chair. As I stood, the clouds shifted, allowing a beam of moonlight to fully illuminate their faces. My heart stalled in my chest. Their skin was a sickening, translucent gray, like the belly of a dead fish washed up on the riverbank. But it was their eyes that paralyzed me. There was no white, no iris, just 2 solid, fathomless voids of absolute blackness. They were pits of endless, ancient dark that seemed to actively absorb the pale moonlight. Looking into them felt like looking over the edge of a bottomless cliff. A wave of profound, suffocating dread washed over me, a feeling of pure, unadulterated evil that made my knees weak. The boy took 1 step up onto the wooden stairs. "Open the door," he commanded. It wasn't a request anymore. The words echoed inside my skull, a heavy, hypnotic weight that dragged at my mind. "We are coming inside, now." The psychic pressure was immense, urging my limbs to step aside and open the front door. But the sheer terror radiating from those black eyes snapped my survival instinct into overdrive. "Get off my property!" I roared, a primal, guttural sound tearing from my throat. I didn't wait for a response. I spun around, lunged for the front door, and practically threw myself inside. I slammed the heavy wooden door shut, violently twisting the deadbolt and throwing the chain lock. I backed away, my chest heaving, listening to the suffocating silence outside. There was no knocking, no pounding, no footsteps retreating down the gravel. I sat on the floor of my hallway with a loaded shotgun across my lap until the sun came up. I didn't close my eyes once. It was only when the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon that the spell was finally broken. Suddenly, as if a switch had been flipped back on, the morning birds began to sing. The frogs resumed their croaking. The natural world had returned.
When I finally gathered the courage to open the door, the porch was empty. But I will never forget that terrifying silence. It taught me that there are things walking this earth that are so unnatural, so inherently evil, that even Mother Nature holds her breath until they pass. There is a distinct, unsettling difference between pulling into a 24-hour gas station and pulling into a state highway rest area in the dead of night. A gas station has an attendant. It has commerce. It has a reason to exist. But a highway rest area at 3 a.m. is a true liminal space, a concrete island floating in a sea of darkness, designed for nothing more than a temporary pause. When you step out of your car at one of these desolate stops, you feel profoundly disconnected from the rest of the world. I was driving straight through the Midwest, pushing a grueling 20-hour trip from Chicago down to Atlanta. It was mid-November, the kind of bitterly cold night where the frost clings to the edges of the windshield. By the time I passed mile marker 81 on a desolate stretch of interstate in Kentucky, the coffee had run its course, and I desperately needed to stretch my legs and use a restroom. I took the long, curved exit ramp into a state rest area. It was surrounded by towering, dense pine trees that seemed to swallow the ambient light. The parking lot was vast, illuminated by tall sodium vapor lights that cast a sickly, orange hue over the cracked asphalt. I was the only car there. No long-haul truckers sleeping in the back lot. No families taking a break. Just me. I parked right in front of the main brick building, pulled my heavy coat tight around my shoulders, and stepped out into the biting cold. The only sound was the low mechanical hum of a row of vending machines glowing brightly in the breezeway. I walked into the men's room. It smelled of harsh pine bleach and stale water. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed angrily, flickering with a dying ballast. I washed my hands quickly, eager to get back to the warm, locked sanctuary of my car. I didn't like the silence of this place. It felt heavy, expectant. I pushed the heavy metal door open and stepped back out into the freezing breezeway. I immediately stopped dead in my tracks. Standing exactly between me and my car, bathed in the sickly orange light of the parking lot, was a teenage boy. He was wearing a faded, oversized Letterman jacket that looked like it belonged in the 1980s. His head was down, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I hesitated. A teenager, alone, at a rest stop at 3 a.m. was strange, but not inherently supernatural. I took a cautious step forward, intending to just walk wide around him. "Hey," I muttered, giving a tight, polite nod. He didn't move, but as I took another step, a movement to my left caught my eye. Sitting perfectly still on a concrete picnic table near the tree line was a little girl in a thin, pale dress. My heart did a strange flutter. I glanced to my right. Standing by the glowing vending machines, partially obscured by the shadows, were two more kids, maybe 10 or 11 years old. They hadn't been there 2 minutes ago when I pulled in. There were no other cars. There was no bus. Where did they come from? The primal lizard part of my brain instantly recognized the pattern before my logical mind could process it. This wasn't a group of lost children. It was a perimeter. They had strategically positioned themselves to cut off my escape routes. I was entirely surrounded. "Excuse me," the teenager in the Letterman jacket finally spoke. His voice was a physical shock to my system. It didn't belong to a human teenager. It was entirely flat, devoid of any natural cadence, yet it resonated with an unnatural, booming volume that echoed across the empty parking lot.
It sounded like a voice synthesized through an old, blown-out speaker. "We need a ride," he stated. Not a question, a demand. He slowly lifted his head, and the orange streetlights finally illuminated his face. My stomach violently dropped, and the breath was sucked out of my lungs. His skin was a sickly, translucent gray, stretched too tight over his cheekbones. But his eyes, they were a nightmare made real. There were no whites, no irises. They were solid, fathomless pits of absolute, glossy black. They looked like twin pools of crude oil, reflecting nothing, offering nothing but an endless, terrifying void. A wave of paralyzing, suffocating dread washed over me. It was an aura of pure, predatory evil that made my legs feel like lead. Simultaneously, in perfect, terrifying synchronization, the little girl on the picnic table and the two boys by the vending machines turned their heads to face me. Even from a distance, I could see it. They all possessed the exact same solid black eyes. "Our mother is waiting for us," the teenager said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward me. "Unlock your doors. We are coming with you." The hypnotic weight of his command slammed into my mind. A terrifying lethargy began to cloud my thoughts. It would be so easy to just press the button on my key fob. They just needed a ride. But as the teenager took another step, closing the distance, the sheer survival instinct hardwired into my DNA violently overrode the psychic pressure. Adrenaline, cold and electric, flooded my veins. I didn't speak. I didn't negotiate. I bolted. I sprinted toward my car with a frantic, desperate speed I didn't know I possessed. The moment I moved, the illusion of their stillness shattered. They moved too. Not with the clumsy gait of children, but with a terrifying, fluid speed that defied biology. I reached the driver's side door, my hands shaking violently as I jammed my thumb against the unlock button on my fob. The car beeped. I tore the door open and threw myself inside. Before I could even pull the door shut, they were there. The teenager slammed his pale hands against the driver's side window. The little girl appeared at the windshield, her black eyes staring directly into mine through the glass. The other two swarmed the passenger side. Bang, 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 bang. They didn't tap. They pounded on the glass in perfect, horrifying unison, their faces pressed against the windows. "Let us in!" Their voices echoed simultaneously, not through the air, but directly inside my head. A chorus of flat, synthetic demands that felt like a physical weight crushing my skull. "Open the door!" I screamed, a raw sound of absolute terror as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I didn't bother checking my mirrors or shifting smoothly. I threw the car into drive and stomped the gas pedal to the floor. The heavy sedan lurched forward, tires shrieking in protest as they spun on the cold asphalt. The figures were thrown back by the sheer momentum of the vehicle. I tore out of the parking lot, blowing past the yield sign, and merged violently onto the dark interstate, pushing the speedometer past 90. I drove for 3 straight hours, my chest heaving, tears streaming down my face, utterly convinced that at any moment I would look in my rearview mirror and see those solid black eyes staring back at me from the back seat. I survived that night, but I will never, under any circumstances, stop at a highway rest area again. Because I now carry the horrifying knowledge that out there in the dark, on the lonely stretches of road between cities, there are predators that hunt in packs, and they wear the faces of children to disarm you before they strike.